is at an end. We have found a new home, and here we shall live and die. These were the words spoken by the Princess Nymeria as she set flame to the thousands of ships that had brought her and the rest of the Rhoynar to the shores of Dorne, and it is this event that is set to be the focus of a brand new Game of Thrones prequel series. Stick around to find out what this might be about. I'm Brennan Sem for the New Wave Nerds. Subscribe down below for more nerd content and commentary. Now let's get into the news. From IGN, George R.R. Martin says previously scrapped Game of Thrones spin-off 10,000 Ships has been revived. Nothing is ever dead indeed. Game of Thrones creator George R.R. Martin announced that the pilot for 10,000 Ships, the scrapped prequel series, is once again in the works. In a blog on Martin's website, the author congratulated writer Eboni Booth for winning a Pulitzer Prize for her play Primary Truth. In the same breath of congratulating her, the Game of Thrones creator confirmed that the pilot for 10,000 Ships is being penned by Booth herself. Quote, "She is an amazingly talented young playwright and a joy to work with. When not writing and producing her prize-winning plays on and off Broadway, she has been kept busy by me and HBO working on a new pilot for 10,000 Ships, a Game of Thrones spin-off about Nymeria and the Rhoynar. We're all very excited about this one, though we're still trying to figure out how we're going to pay for 10,000 ships, 300 dragons, and those giant turtles." So this is another piece of news that I'm really interested in hearing. I'm fairly familiar with the story. I have access to the Game of Thrones history of Westeros. Let me hold it up here for you. The World of Ice and Fire. And I've read through that a couple times, so I vaguely know the story. I'm not super familiar with it, but it is absolutely fascinating. And it is a story that they have mentioned on the show multiple times. It is, they haven't necessarily gone in depth in it, but they have name-dropped Nymeria. Obviously, it's the namesake for Arya's direwolf, and more recently in House of Dragon, I've forgotten her name, Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra discusses Nymeria with the Lady Alicent. I believe that's even in the first episode, perhaps the second one, but that is relatively early on. And so this is an interesting story to pursue. I'm kind of curious what they're going to do with this. Despite the fact that I am really interested in seeing this story, if I'm going to be honest here, guys, and I might be alone in this because it is sort of the focal point of the entire franchise, but in my opinion, the dragons are so overdone. They're so overdone now. Do we need a third series where the focal point, or perhaps not the focal point, but one of the main features in the beginning is a whole score of dragons, a horde of 300 swarming down upon the host of Prince Garen? I don't think we necessarily need that. We've seen a lot of dragons. Obviously, they're the main focal point of both the mainline show and the House of Dragon itself. I just think that there are other really fascinating stories that could be explored in the world of Westeros outside of the consequences of the Targaryens and of the blood of old Valyria, right? Obviously, we're sort of moving past that a little bit here because the main focus is on the Princess Nymeria, who is not herself Valyrian. She's a member of the Rhoynar, is the people. And the story is actually really, really interesting. So basically, the people from Volantis set up colonies along the Mother Rhoyne, which is the river upon which the Rhoynar have found life, right? It is the basis of their entire culture and society. They are a water people. They even go so far as, at least how it's recorded in the World of Ice and Fire, is they have, quote, water wizards. They have people who are able to commune with and control the Mother Rhoyne itself. And then the people of Volantis settle along the Rhoyne, and initially the Rhoynar welcome them. They welcome the opportunity to expand or to enrich themselves and to have allies and friends in the region. But naturally, over the course of the years, the societies clash, and eventually there is conflict between the Rhoynar and the Volantines. And then it's at this point that the Volantines reach out to the city of Freehold and ask for aid and assistance. And the Rhoynar gather up this host, as I briefly mentioned earlier, led by Prince Garin the Great, who is this a Rhoynar prince who has convinced the other leaders of these cities to amass a single great host to finally drive out the Volantines. And so the Volantines reach out to Freehold for help, and Freehold, who do they send? A whole horde of dragons. as George briefly mentions in that quote there that I read right at the end of this section of the article, he talks about 300 dragons. So this is a massive, a veritable horde. I think horde is probably, I don't know what you would necessarily call a group of dragons. What do we have? We have like a murder of crows. It wouldn't be a herd. A pack of dragons, maybe? No, that doesn't necessarily... A pride? Like lions? I don't know. What do you call? A clutch? Maybe it's a clutch, right? I've heard... At least I think they use the term clutch mates in WoW. But I think that's typically used to refer to, like, select groups that were hatched together and raised and reared together. So I don't know. This is a weird question. Let me know down below. What do you guys think a group of dragons is called? I don't know. I'm not going to Google it right now because I want to see what you guys think. But so they send this massive horde of dragons, and naturally 300 dragons just absolutely crushes the army and legion amassed by Prince Garin the Great. And after this devastating defeat, Nymeria sees death upon the horizon. She knows that despite the fact that she spoke out against Prince Garin's campaign in the beginning, she ultimately lended her people and her warriors to the campaign. And so because of that, she is next on the hit list. Her city, her people are going to be swarmed and demolished by this horde of dragons. And so because of this, Nymeria gathers every remaining ship in the city. She gathers all the remaining women and children, because most of the men have gone off to fight with Prince Garin and subsequently died. Presumably there are a few of the elderly men, some of the young, and I would just assume that there are a few average middle-aged men as well, but the numbers are drastically disproportionate. And so then we set along this campaign where Princess Nymeria is attempting to lead this massive group of 10,000 ships across the area, across the sea, to try and figure out where they are going to settle. And there's a veritable, there's at least like 5 different places that they visit explicitly mentioned in the world of Ice and Fire. The only one I can remember at this point is they land at the Isle of Noth, which is the home place of Missandei from the original Game of Thrones. And the Isle of Noth, they're a very peace-loving people, and they welcome the Rhoynar with open arms. But as it's the way that it's described in the book as that the god of Noth is angered by the imposition of this foreign people, and so sends a plague down. And because of that, then the Rhoynar have to flee. But there are multiple different interesting little episodic stories that you could tell here, landing on the Axe Isle and having to deal with the Corsairs. And then eventually, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Princess Nymeria brings her people to the land of Dorne. And Mars Martell, who is the Lord of Sunship, I think is how it's described in the book, he sees the opportunity here. He sees the strength of the Rhoynar. Because in Rhoynar society, men and women are equal, and women are often fighters as well. At least, I believe it says a quarter of all the women are highly trained fighters that have traveled with Nymeria. And furthermore, there are, a host of young boys who have grown up along this trek and have been trained in the way of the spear, and such are warriors as well. And so Mars Martell realizes the benefit here, and as the legend goes, his heart is taken by the Princess Nymeria, and so they seal their bond by marriage, and Mars Martell increased his host by a purported tenfold. And so they have this massive army, and then the Princess Nymeria and Prince Martell, who is now a prince because he's married Nymeria, the prince and princess honorific title. I don't know if honorific is correct, but the title of prince and princess comes from the Rhoynar, and so this is where we get the merging of these two cultures, and this is why the society of Dornish people, as we see it in Game of Thrones, however briefly we see it in the series, at least through Pedro Pascal, not Doran Martell. Oh, he plays the Red Viper, man, and I really like him too. Let's see, we're just gonna go find it here. Not Doran, because that's the prince. He's in Sunspear, and he's only shown for like, I want to say like less than a scene. Oberyn Martell. There we go. I thought it started with an O, but I could not remember. That was gonna really irritate me. It was gonna irritate me especially because I really like him. I thought that was an interesting story, and so expanding upon that, about how the fact that I liked Oberyn Martell and I wish he'd been showcased more, one of my big complaints about the Game of Thrones mainline series, the mainline TV show, has been how the Dornish people were really sidelined and there were no real plot lines, right? We only very briefly address what's going on there. And in the book, the Dornish have their own plot as to how they're going to retake the throne. And I think it's really interesting, and it's only very briefly explored in the books. Hopefully it gets explored in 6 if we ever get to see that. But I'm really glad that we're going to see a little bit more of this society. I think that's incredibly interesting to me. It's also worth noting that Princess Nymeria ruled in Dorne for like 27 years, and she was well loved and well known, and I believe she took after Mars Martell died, she took on 2 separate husbands. One is a Dane, the Sword of the Morning. I want to say it's Sir Davos Dane, the Sword of the Morning. But notably, when Nymeria dies, the succession does not pass to her firstborn son. Her firstborn son is by Sir Davos Dane, her third husband. The line of succession passes from Princess Nymeria to her first child by Mars Martell, her first daughter, thus setting the standard for and further integrating these two cultures between the Rhoynar and the Dornish. And so I think this is a really interesting story to explore. I don't know if this would have been my first choice, just because, like I said, I think the dragons are really overdone at this point. I would like to see some other aspects of the world. Granted, one of the things I've asked for most has been a series centering on Aegon the Conqueror. I think that would be amazing. But I maintain that I feel dragons are way overdone now. And I realize that this is like a fantastical element, and this is one of the things that makes Game of Thrones Game of Thrones. And so I understand wanting to pull that through as much as possible. But at the same time, and maybe I'm unique here, like I said, maybe this is going to get hate for me saying this, but to me, the most interesting parts of Game of Thrones aren't the scenes with the dragons. I don't watch Game of Thrones for the dragons. I didn't watch House of Dragon for the dragons. Like, the dragons are cool and they're awesome, and I think that they make some amazing scenes, and they're just obviously just a massively wonderful and cool mythological creature. And I think it's fun that we're using this fantasy setting to sort of explore all of these other things. But I don't come to Game of Thrones for the dragons. I come to Game of Thrones for the Game of Thrones. I come to see the political intrigue. And maybe I'm alone. Maybe I'm weird in that. But I just think at this point, we've seen a lot of dragons. I mean, we had a whole series focused on the House of the Dragon, focused on the Targaryens at the not necessarily the height of their power, but at an important moment in their history wherein they still have access to multiple dragons. They have many eggs. And I'm not very far into the first season of House of Dragon. I think I'm halfway through the 4th or 5th episode. And so maybe there is time to turn this around. But my big complaint about it, so I think it's great. It's a really fun show. I think the effects are amazing. I think the acting, the performance, I think the costume design, the set design, all of it's amazing. I really like it. The cinematography is beautiful. The writing is great. I really, really like it. But my big complaint has been that, to me at least, it feels like there has been so much less of the intrigue. It just has been relatively non-existent. And at least compared to Game of Thrones, right? At least compared to Game of Thrones. Now, granted, Game of Thrones happens in a world where the dragons have all but died out, and so there's much more power play work going on here. There's much more scheming and conniving. There's a much higher likelihood that a different family could rise to sit on the Iron Throne. So I recognize that, but I really, really would have liked to have seen a lot more of the scheming in the background in the House of Dragon. And so it's because of that I think that there are other stories that would be really well served to be explored in the world of Westeros. I think there are plenty of other areas that could be explored here. And I'm not saying that there has to be no dragons. You know, I'm not saying that it's like we have to take out all the dragons completely and just act like they never existed. But I just think at this point, we've seen enough of them that they don't need to be the focus. And so my big hope, my hope for this upcoming series, 10,000 series, and my big fear is that they focus too heavily on the dragons themselves. I don't know, in the actual story as it's laid out in the world of Ice and Fire, the instance with the dragons itself is it's relegated to pretty much just a paragraph, right? So presumably, at least, we would hopefully only see that in one episode, and then we wouldn't necessarily have to hear from them any further. That would be what I would like to see, what I would like to hear. I think that would make for a much more interesting story, personally. I think it makes it much more human and it makes it obviously much more grounded if there's less dragons. And I think that allows you to put more of the focus on the characters and what's going on in the background. And that's really, really what I would like to see from this. But why don't we get back to the article here to see what the creators have said about this show. 10,000 Ships is a spin-off set a millennium before the events of Game of Thrones. It follows Princess Nymeria, an ancestor of House Martell and founder of the Kingdom of Dorne. The series was first reported to be in the works back in 2021 before HBO scrapped the project entirely. Founder of Kingdom of Dorne. I had actually forgotten to really go in on that. Yes, Nymeria helps found the unified Kingdom of Dorne because after she marries Mars Martell and they amass this army, the two of them set about conquering the many petty kings and the many different cities and areas that are in Dorne. That, I think, would be really cool to see, the unification of the Kingdom of Dorne. That's what I hope most of the series is focused on. The series was first reported to be in the works back in 2021 before HBO scrapped the project entirely. In a recent interview with Inverse, 10,000 Ships writer Brian Helgeland likened the scrapped pilot of 10,000 ships to the Sinbad films, The Odyssey, and the biblical tale of Moses. So we've got a pretty interesting amalgamation here. I like that he's hearkening back to some of the most important stories in the history of Western civilization and in the Western canon and in all of literature, right? Like, even if you don't believe that if you are an atheist or a pagan or whatever, and you don't believe the Bible to be the word of God, and you think it's just a fictional story, it is undeniable that it is one of the greatest stories ever told. There's even a movie called that, The Greatest Story Ever Told, and it is one of the most important works in the entirety of Western civilization. And I maintain that for the Odyssey as well, written by Homer. So I've actually got the article here with the full statement from Brian Helgeland. I've skipped down to where it is because it's quite a long article, and it's not all about Game of Thrones. They spent a lot of time talking about Training Day and Denzel Washington. But the interviewer asks, I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan, and I know you were originally attached as a writer for one of the potential spin-offs that wasn't picked up. Is there anything you can say about that experience? And then Brian replies, it came out great, but I think they felt the period of my show was too far removed from the pillars of the original. That's why it hasn't been picked up yet, but nothing is ever dead. My script was based on Queen Nymeria and this little blurb about her that was in a Westeros encyclopedia. Essentially, it was the story of Moses, but swapping him out for Nymeria. Essentially, I mean, I guess in the sense that they have to both lead their people to a new, promised land. Anyways, her country gets ruined and her people are forced to live on the water, which is why the show was called 10,000 Ships. They end up having to leave and find a new home like the Israelites leaving Egypt. She's leading all these people, trying to hold everyone together, but these things are always in danger of falling apart as they travel around a fictionalized version of the Mediterranean, looking for a new home to settle in. Their life was nomadic, living in a raft city that was bound together, this big floating city. Sometimes the characters would come ashore, but they ultimately get driven off the land as they search for a home, their version of the Promised Land. I met with George R.R. Martin to pitch him the idea, which he signed off on. Sadly, I didn't work with him closer, but I would have done if the show was picked up. It was kind of like Ray Harryhausen's Sinbad films mixed with the Odyssey. In a way, Nymeria is Odysseus, but instead of a 12-person crew, she's responsible for every citizen in this floating city-state. My work is still there if HBO wants to pick it up. I enjoyed my time developing it, and you just never know. Now, that much is true. You really do never know, as they say. There's really no way to tell. I don't know. Okay, so here's the thing: is that I don't know if this is if the script that Eboni Booth, the creator that George referenced in the beginning of the article and in a recent blog post on his blog, I don't know if she is working with the same themes. I don't know if she has just taken his script and altered it slightly, or if she has decided to just completely go a different direction entirely with the ship. I'm not 100% sure. My guess is that she's probably writing her own, right? If this is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, she just won an award for her whatever play. I think it was called Finding Truth. I could go back into the article to search for it, but it's not. It's ancillary to the story. So she strikes me as the kind of person who would, if she's going to work on it, she would probably want to, make it her own and do her own thing and not just pick up what somebody else has put down. I do hope, however, that she keeps those themes too, if she also harkens back to some of these great works in the Western canon, the Odyssey, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Sinbad films, those great stories of Western canon that everybody should read, the Sinbad films. I hope that she sort of keeps some of those themes yet, and she doesn't just completely toss that aside to sort of make it her own completely original thing. To me, that would probably be a signal that it would be slightly less deep thematically than the Brian Helgeland prequel or pilot script. But ultimately, I am really, really interested to this. But we'll have to wait as to an update for this. Like we mentioned, they're only really working on the pilot right now, so this is a very long ways off. And George definitely has his hands full, coming up with excuses as to why he hasn't finished the 6th book, as well as working on the he's got his own sci-fi anthology series that he's working on, as well as the new Dunk and Egg series, which a few months ago, I guess, found its leads. So he has definitely got his fingers in a lot of pies. Now, ultimately, I would just like him to stop working on everything and just ask him to please finish the 6th book. But likely that is not what is going to happen. To fill your Game of Thrones need up until then, the House of Dragon Season 2 premieres this Sunday, the 16th, so make sure that you don't miss that. It will be on HBO, and we will be back here tomorrow with a brand new news segment, and I will see you guys then.